And thank you everybody for joining us this morning or afternoon for me to give you a presentation on the current ADC clinical pipeline. In today's talk, I'm going to discuss the current ADC pipeline. I'll provide some details of some of the novel ADCs that have entered the clinic recently, and I'll discuss some of the progression of the ADC pipeline. I'll then move on to discuss the current state of ADC payloads and the increasing diversity of these in the clinic. And then next I'll discuss some of the trends that we at Beacon have identified in ADC clinical trials, in particular more combinations of ADCs with immune checkpoint modulators, and also the use of biomarkers both prospectively and retrospectively to stratify patients for best response. And then finally I will look a little bit into the future and discuss some of the areas that I think are probably worth keeping an eye on, certainly in the first half of 2017. So the number of ADCs currently in the clinic in active clinical testing is 59. For this analysis we use only drugs that are standard antibody drug conjugates, in that they have an antibody linked to a cytotoxic payload. So in that respect, we haven't been including other related formats for this analysis, like the peptide drug conjugates or the immunotoxins, for example. This number of 59 is constantly changing as ADCs enter the clinic or are discontinued. So I would class an ADC as being discontinued once it's been dropped from a clinical pipeline on a company website, even though there may still be ongoing clinical trials for a particular drug. And conversely, we class an ADC as being an active ADC once it's listed on a clinical trial registry, such as clinicaltrials.gov, but we're also searching other international registries as well. So this number 59 has been hovering about this number of active ADCs for about a year now, but within that it hides quite a lot of movement. So for example, just last month I presented at World ADC, and since then there have been 3 new ADCs enter the clinic, and also 3 that have been discontinued, to make the round number of 59 still the same number. So as I said, the number is constantly changing, but looking at the numbers of ADCs entering the clinic as an indicator of the movement of the drugs in the field, we can see that the number of ADCs entering the clinic has been rising consistently year on year, especially 2014 and 2015, where we saw, in 2015 we saw 17 new ADCs enter the clinic. So far in 2016, we've seen 10 new ADCs in the clinic. It's not as high as it was last year, but as you'll see in the next slide, it's some of the companies that are entering clinical trials, it's their first ADC into the clinical trial space. And so it's kind of showing considerable expansion of new technologies into the space. So let's discuss in a little bit more detail some of the ADCs in phase 1. The purple highlighted drugs are drugs that have entered the clinic in the last, since September 2015. And instantly you can see that roughly a third of the phase 1 ADCs have started in the last 15 months. When we look at the different companies that are involved in these new ADCs, we can see a number of key players. We've got Immunogen, Seattle Genetics, and Agencis, for example, but also some new companies, Masana, Remogen, and Abgenomics as well. And if we have a look in a little bit more detail at each of these different ADCs, and look at the component parts of the ADCs. And the first thing to note is that we actually know quite a lot about all of these ADCs. Granted, there are a couple that we know very little about, but on the whole, we know quite a lot so far, even though they've only just entered the clinic. So we can see instantly that there are quite a lot of different targets being investigated. Some are novel for ADCs, including Agencis's FLT3 ADC, the CDX014, which targets TIM1, Cadherin-6 from Novartis, and a HER3 targeting ADC from Daiichi Sankyo. And then there's some more established targets such as HER2 and CD19 and CD33 as well. Equally, when we look at the different payloads that are involved in these ADCs, we can see that there's quite a lot of variety there. We've got PBDs, we've got novel auristatins, we've got immunogens, indolinobenzodiazepine as well. A few of these new ADCs that I think are probably worth highlighting would be the Daiichi Sankyo ADC down here. And this ADC has only recently, in the last month, entered the clinic. This is a HER3 targeting ADC and has been listed on a Japanese clinical trial registry, as I said, earlier on this month. Also, it's worth highlighting Masana's new ADC that's entered the clinic, XMT1522. This targets HER2, but it uses their Fleximer technology to produce an ADC with a drug-to-antibody ratio of about 15. It's a novel technology that's entering the clinic, and we're quite interested in seeing how this progresses. And finally, in the middle here, Genentech's thiamab antibiotic conjugate. This is targeting Staph aureus and has an antibiotic component as its cytotoxic payload. And the reason I've included this, and the reason that I think this is an interesting one, is because it marks a significant expansion of the ADC technology into other spaces, rather than just focusing on oncology as their only mechanism of action. We're moving into other different modes, and so infectious diseases is a novel space for antibody drug conjugates. So then moving on to look at pipeline progression into phase 2 and phase 3. To me, this seems like the area that's seen the most movement over 2016. So for all we've seen quite a few ADCs entering the clinic, it wasn't as much as it has been in the previous years. But for me, this is the progression from phase 1 into phase 2 and then also into phase 3 has seen the biggest change over 2016. So as you can see, nearly half of the ADCs in phase 2 have recently progressed from phase 1. Some of these phase 2 trials have been identified as registrational phase 2. So the anatumab ravtansine, the Bayer drug here, Rover-T has also been identified as a registrational trial, and glembatubimab vedotin as well as a registrational phase 2 clinical trial. On top of that, we've also got three ADCs that have progressed into phase 3. And also we've had the promising results from inotuzumab ozogamicin earlier on in the year. And so when you combine the registrational phase 2s and the phase 3s, we can see that we've got 7 ADCs in the later stages of clinical testing, from which FDA approval may be sought pending a good trial.